Hi everyone. I am Jennifer Hinke. I'm the laboratory manager at the Coachella Valley Mosquito and Vector Control District. And you're watching the Npdes training. This is part of our annual pesticide handler training. I'm going to cover things like what is Npdes, what you do in order to make sure we're compliant with what we're doing, and who else is responsible for some different pieces of that. Let's get started. So Npdes is a bunch of letters, but it stands for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Program. And this is all part of the Clean Water Act regulations. So it can be administered by both a state or by the US EPA. And that's important to us in that we actually have two Npdes permits here at the district. We have one permit that covers the work that we're doing on California land. And so everything that we do on a California land that goes into a water of the US is governed by that California permit. We also have several tribes that are here, and tribal land is not California land. It's not federal land, it is tribal land, and it belongs to the tribe. But it is covered under sovereign nation negotiations between the US federal government and that tribe. And so in order to continue our work on those properties and to make sure that we're not causing any harm to the water of those properties, we also have a federal Npdes permit. And so that is why we have two permits where a lot of other agencies don't, and why we have some additional work that we do every winter to try and show what we're doing and make sure that everybody knows why we're doing all of those things that we're doing. So, Npdes is designed to control water pollution by regulating point sources that discharge pollutants into the water of the US. There was a court case that went through and discussed whether or not mosquito control applications could be considered as pollutants. And it wasn't just mosquito control applications, it fell into a number of other pesticide applications, but that particular court case, as it went through, decided that the nozzles that we use, the ends of our backpacks, the ends of our spray cans, the ends of our foggers, those are point sources. So that is very similar to what you're seeing here in the picture of water flowing from a pipe. We know what's coming out of the end of the nozzle. And so therefore, if that pesticide is potentially a pollutant, we can control it there at the nozzle, there at the backpack, and there at the individual applicator. Point source pollution can be traced back to exactly where it entered the water. And so that's why it is something that's regulated under this Npdes permit. The other kind of pollution is called non-point source pollution. And so this is more easily thought of if you think about runoff that's coming off of people's yards. Perhaps there's some pesticides that are on some residents' yards, and those all get washed off in the rain. They all come down into a catch basin. You test the water that's in the catch basin, and you can find that there's pesticide there, but you don't necessarily know which of the houses or which ones of the houses it ended up coming from. And so you have to do a little bit more digging to be able to figure that out and to make those kinds of control efforts to prevent pollution from entering the water. Much different than what you're doing with our applications where we know what came out of our nozzles when. So the next part of that definition is, well, what is a water of the US? And there are lots of things that can fall underneath this category. Waters that are interstate or foreign commerce. So these are things that go in between states or in between countries, like the Rio Grande. Interstate waters, so waters again between states, so the river between Ohio and Pennsylvania. This is a great one that's a interstate water. Intrastate waters, so waters that are within one state, but the use, degradation, or destruction of which would or could affect interstate or foreign commerce. So you can see that's a very legal definition, lots of tough words in there. Basically, it's a water within one state that if that water, if that lake or stream were degraded, if it were allowed to fall into disrepair, that it's going to impact other interstate or foreign commerce going into that area. We'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. impoundments of waters of the US. So if you build a dam on a river, like the Hoover Dam, well, just because you have a lake now that's impounded by that stream, or that stream is impounded by that dam, that doesn't mean that lake is not a water of the US. It is. You just took it out temporarily, and it's going to go back to that stream downstream. So that's still a water of the US. Tributaries of those waters, so anything that's going into any of these previous categories of waters. The territorial sea, which is 3 miles out from the border, that's all considered a water of the US. And wetlands. So we're going to talk a little bit about more what a wetland is and what is not considered a water of the US under some definitions we've had. So what all kinds of things can be included in interstate commerce? Here, the big one for us has been the duck clubs. We have people that are coming from one state, maybe Arizona, maybe flying down from somewhere else, and using the duck clubs for recreation. And they're paying money to somebody in order to be able to use that property. And that is because of that commerce, because of that exchange of money, and because of that exchange of people across the state line, that is what, for us, is terming it a water of the US. In other cases, you might be talking about the sale of fish or shellfish that come out of a water. So if you collect a bunch of rainbow trout, you sell them, all of a sudden, where you got those rainbow trout from, that could be a water of the US. And interstate industrial use, this is really common in the Northeast. For example, between Pennsylvania and Ohio, again, there's a great river that flows between the two. And there's lots of industries that take water out of the river and put it back in after they're done. Maybe they're cooling plants, or they're cooling something in their industry. Well, that could be a point source pollution if there's something that they're putting back into the water, and then that could be potentially impacting a water of the US because it's between the two states. Courts have also ruled on a couple of places where it's not a water of the US, and these sometimes feel a little tricky, but we'll walk through them slowly. The first one is waste treatment systems, and it does have some very particular language around it. It needs to be a treatment pond or a lagoon that was man-made, so made by people, not originally a water of the US, and not an impoundment of the water of the US. And so this is the place where some of our experienced staff know that this one's a little tricky. You can see here a picture of the Valley Sanitary District, and at one time there were a number of ponds that weren't really being used for treatment. They did start off being used for treatment, but they later were not. But we continue to call them waters of the US. And we did that because it fails this test of not being one in a couple of ways. One is that the discharge of these ponds goes back into a water of the US, into the Whitewater River. And that can be termed a temporary impoundment of the water, and so therefore it's a water of the US. It belongs in that. And two, we did have people that were coming to visit these ponds, these lagoons, and watching for birds. And some of those people were coming from out of town. Definitely some people could have been coming from other states. If those people were paying money then to do that, one could consider, well, is that interstate commerce? And so therefore, would it fail this not being a water of the US? So we always counted them as waters of the US, and if you go to do the work there, you'll often see that there still are waters of the US there on the site because they're flowing back out into the Whitewater River. The other thing that's not a water of the US, it's again a super tricky definition, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because we don't have them here in our district, but it's a term called prior converted cropland. This is a very specific EPA jurisdiction. What's going on is that there was land that maybe was a wetland or stream bank at some point when it was first settled. It got converted to being cropland, and then at a certain time point in the 1980s, it stopped being a cropland, and they converted back to letting it just be wild land or land that wasn't managed. Well, if somebody goes back and wants to then remake it into cropland or refarm it in some way, that would not be a water of the US because it's got this history point, this long-standing time point where it was a farm or it was a cropland. again, like we don't have any of these here in the Coachella Valley. There are some in other parts of the state, so I want you to know it as a term in case you get a job at one of those other districts, but it's not something that we spend a lot of time being worried about here. So the main thing that all of us do when we go to make applications is that we're monitoring what's going on in the environment around us. And this is how we comply with both of these Npdes permits, is that we are watching to ensure that our applications do not have an adverse impact. And so these terms are called adverse incidents, and it requires two criteria to be filled with that. One is that we made an application at that site, and two, that someone or something is suffering what's termed a toxic or adverse effect as a result of the application, right? So there's a causal link. Our application made somebody sick, made something distressed, made something happen, besides just happening to the mosquitoes, right? So our applications are designed to kill mosquitoes. That one's okay. But if we're harming anything else, then that if it was our application that caused that would be termed this toxic or adverse effect. So let's go through a few examples of those. Legally, they are written out in a number of pieces of this. They're included but not limited to all sorts of things. You can see primarily we're going to talk about fish, but really if you see anything not behaving in a way that you would expect it to, you're going to be thoughtful about potentially reporting that, and let's see what's going on. So toxic or adverse effects include but are not limited to distressed or dead juvenile and small fish, washed up or floating fish, fish swimming abnormally or erratically. They don't swim the way that you expect them to. They're lying lethargically at the water surface or in shallow water. They're listless or they're non-responsive to disturbance. So you come up to the bank and they don't move. Then if you're looking at the plants look burned, they look stunted, they don't look like other plants in nearby areas. You see other dead or distressed non-target organisms like amphibians, turtles, or other invertebrates. If it's a person, you may see a skin rash, or you see that they're suffering from some sort of illness, and that you're noticing that animals are becoming sick from direct contact with the water or from ingesting plants or animals exposed to the water. So you see one of those out in the field, you're concerned. You should be. The step for you then to take is to contact your field supervisor, the operations manager, and the laboratory manager. And you need to contact all three of us, and we're going to be asking you for these pieces of information. How did you become aware of the problem? Did you see it? Did somebody report it to you? Where are you? What's the source site ID? Or give us a description of where you are so we can come and find and help you with the report that's going to happen for this. What chemical was used, if any, and anything that you did to correct or clean up the situation. So for example, if it was a person that had a rash, maybe you helped apply some first aid for the person, we'd want to know that. If this happened to have been a spill, then we'd want to know what you did to clean up the spill. The reason that you need to report all this is that there is a time limit, and the district is responsible for meeting that time limit. The way we are set up is that the laboratory manager makes a report to the EPA or the State Water Board, depending on where you were, within 24 hours. And it's a phone call, and there's a lot of information that I will be working with you to get to make sure that we can make that report quickly. Then there's a longer written report that's due 5 days after we make that first report. So we have a pretty quick turnaround to get all that information back to the right people. There are a number of resources that you can look at if you're more interested in our Npdes program and what we're doing. You can see the California Vector Control Permit on our webpage, and this is the year that we're due for a new one, so we'll be updating that one soon. You could go to the State Water Resources Control Board page and see the Vector Control Permit, as well as see what other districts have reported there. And for more information on the federal Npdes program, you can go to the website there. I'm always happy to answer any questions that you might have. Feel free to send me an email or reach out to me. Look forward to talking to you more about Npdes.